going to talk to you today around why age inclusivity is now not a nice to have, it's a must have from organisations, from businesses across the country. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why. I'm going to talk to you around some of the benefits of that and some of the pitfalls to try and avoid, if that makes sense. But let's get cracking. So, little known stat. I love data. 71% of the UK's employment growth over the last 30 years has come from workers aged over 50. Put your hands up if that's a surprise. A few shy hands. Almost a third of the UK's workforce are aged over 50. 1 in 3. Put your hands up if that's a surprise. Okay. I'd expect a few people are not putting their hands up who might still be surprised. But I would, from the conversations I have with people all over the country, I'd be surprised if people are spending a third of their time on talent acquisition in this space, if that makes sense. It's often ignored, underthought of, and it's why stats like this are so powerful to actually frame the conversation. So let's talk about why that is and break down that surprise. So if you look at population growth in the UK, and this follows across all developed nations, population of under 50s in the UK is actually declining. Population of over 50s is where all the UK's population growth. So actually, therefore, it's no surprise when you see stats like 70% of all employment growth is coming from workers over the age of 50. Declining birth rates, COVID accelerated that trend. Rising life expectancy. There's been a short-term blip with COVID, but the long-term trend is very clear. We're living longer, healthier lives. What is clear is with this scale of seismic demographic change, longevity should be front and foremost for all businesses from a commercial perspective and in all businesses from a workforce management perspective. So let's break this down. So if you look at what's going on in terms of the labour market in the UK over the last 30 years, I love a long-term trend, right? I love a graph. Fewer young people entering the workforce. You see actually the blue line at the bottom is the number of 18 to 24-year-olds in the workplace. So it's all the focus on graduate careers, which are very, very important, but they are not growing as a proportion of UK's employment. You look at the proportion of 25 to 49-year-olds, it's steady and high. So the employment rate is 85% in that group. Very hard to push that further, but it's steady and high. You look at that huge green line of 50 plus employment rate, and you're seeing pretty much all of the UK's employment growth is coming from people aged over the age of 50. And the employment rate has gone from 56% to 71%. So actually 71% might seem like a huge growth. It's still substantially lower than the 85% you're seeing for younger cohorts. Now, what is particularly interesting is you can't see it on this slide. If you zoom in over the 10-year horizon, you actually see that that trend has stopped. And that is a pretty compelling chart to show you why the labour market is really, really, really tight right now. So if you look over the last 30 years, all of the growth in employment has come from an older demographic. That is stopped. That stopped when COVID hit for a combination of reasons. But that is exactly why that gap, if you were to draw that line going up, that is the gap in talent that you now can't find in the UK market. But retirement is not the right answer. So a few people have dubbed this the Great Retirement. It's an interesting concept, it's a great headline. It's actually only part of the story. So when we look at what is driving some of these challenges and what we're all very guilty with on a day-to-day basis is ageism. So ageism is something that is very casual, comes across very normally. We talk about it in terms of the last socially acceptable form of prejudice. And of course it's not socially acceptable, but terms that people would not dream about using in terms of different ethnicities or of men and women in today's lexicon are very widely used when it comes to age. And I have it, people say them to me. Despite what we do, we hear them day in, day out from our members, we hear them day in, day out from other people. Now, if you break that down into some of the statistics, you look at this kind of reinforcing chart, and it's good to be aware of this, because if you're conscious of it, actually that can help try and address, it's the first place to try and address it. So if you take the top right, workers in their 50s and 60s, statistically, according to the ONS, they receive less workplace training than younger counterparts. You then flow that through as when they are made redundant, they're far more likely to end up in long-term unemployment. And there's some really, really horrible stats, actually, around men over the age of 50. 50% of unemployed men over the age of 50 have been unemployed for over a year. So to give you a size of the scale of the challenge, it's very common for people to drift into long-term unemployment because they're not receiving the training when they are employed. That reduces confidence, impacts physical, mental health, and that loops back up where they're facing often subtle but clear discrimination in the recruitment process. And perhaps the most common term that our members tell us they face is being told they're overqualified. So it might feel like it's a compliment, right? Because you're saying you're too good for this job. But overqualified, if you're on the other end of that, you hear it day in, day out, it's really insidious. Like it comes up too often. That should be a decision for the candidate, if that makes sense. But what I find really fascinating about ageism is there's a huge inequality in ageing in the UK, and I think it leads to very different outcomes here. And I think it explains why it often goes unseen. So there's a 9-year gap in life expectancy in the UK between most affluent part of the UK and the least affluent. There's a whopping 18-year gap in healthy life expectancy. So it just shows you the inequality from a health perspective of ageing. And quite literally, someone who's 56 could have the same health as someone who's 74. So using age as a marker for anything becomes very irrelevant, actually. But we're great at respecting age when it's followed a linear career path to the top. So most FTSE 100 CEOs will be in their 50s or 60s. You look at US politics, it's dominated by people in their 70s or 80s. So it's totally fine to let people run countries, companies. It's middle management where that bites, and that's where people get told they're overqualified, if that makes sense. But it's also why that inequality is why boards often don't recognise the scale of the problem. So boards will look around the boardroom, we've seen it with our own board, we've seen it elsewhere. They will see an absence of women. They will see an absence of different ethnicities. They do not see an absence of middle-aged people. So they don't actually realise the scale of the problem because it's not them that are affected by it, if that makes sense. So, lazy stereotypes. I love plugging this. So, they are not tech-savvy. It's just something that people will use. It's a horrible term, and it's a huge switch-off for people. So if you want technical skills, specify them. Do you need C++ coding? Do you need JavaScript? Do you need Node, React? Don't need tech-savvy. Tech-savvy actually works, and surveys have showed this as a massive switch-off to an older candidate, even if they are tech-savvy, even if they're a coder. They're expensive. Not from a recruitment perspective. A job is a job. A salary band is a salary band. They come in on the same terms and conditions as everyone else. Interestingly, something I wish I knew back in my 20s is that earnings on average in the UK peak in our 40s. I wish I'd known that because I put more in my pension in my 20s. But it shows that actually salary is not continuous to grow. For those following the career path to CEO, yes, it does. For average, it doesn't. Actually, expensive is a big thing to kind of get out of head. They're difficult to manage. Again, this is something that we hear time and time again. If you have a 20-year-old or 30-year-old hiring manager, it can be daunting or intimidating to have someone who's perhaps done your job in the past or has had a successful career before. Doesn't mean they're going to be difficult to manage. Some will, some 20-year-olds will be difficult to manage. Everyone can be, everyone can't be. It shouldn't be defined by age. They'll get bored quickly. Again, to this point around being overqualified, if you look at those 3 points, collectively, that's what people are concerned about when they lump someone as being overqualified. They're concerned they'll get bored and leave. They're concerned that they'll be difficult to manage. But rather than pick at those threads and actually explore on a candidate-by-candidate basis, they typically get lumped into that overqualified bucket. And this one, I couldn't work with my mum or dad. I certainly couldn't work with my mum or dad. But it's fascinating when you see different role profiles. So parent to child is a role profile that people take on different places. It's very different to how people behave in a workplace setting and differently. But the number of times I've actually had it said to me over 10 times, I couldn't work with my mum or dad when we've talked to them about what restless do. And it's just staggering to separate that. We've got one of our lead engineers came from Just Eat, phenomenally good tech company. He's 61 and he has all the same parental problems that our employees in their 20s have, if that makes sense. The parent-child relationship never goes away, whatever the age. And they don't want to try learn new things. So again, we see this as absolutely not true. They're very curious, they're very hungry, and it's a very person-by-person basis. So how can employers tap into this experienced and underrepresented segment of the workforce? So the first one is look at the language and imagery used in jobs. So I've seen loads of beautiful career sites that have lots of beautiful pictures, very diverse pictures of people in their 20s. That can be a huge turn-off if it's not age inclusive as well as other forms of inclusivity. Look at the language. So we talked about tech savvy. Tech savvy, there's been a lot of research to show it puts off older candidates. It doesn't add to younger candidates' applications, if that makes sense. The absence of it doesn't put off younger candidates, and it actually doesn't screen for digital capability. So screen for digital capability, look for specifics. Look for the specific technologies you're looking to. Because tech savvy in a creative industry is very different from tech savvy in a sales industry, is very different from tech savvy in a tech industry. Look for the specific skills. Think differently about flexibility. So there's, again, to say the size of the opportunity, there's 700,000, when we look at that chart that has changed, 700,000 more economically inactive over 50s since COVID. There's a talent pool of 700,000 people. Now, when the ONS did, because obviously the government gets concerned about things like that, when the ONS did some research on that, 42% of them said they'd consider going back to work. And that was of people who had left the workforce. That is a big talent pool. Now, things that they cite about what they're looking for, they're not looking for expensive salaries. That doesn't come up the list. Some will, some won't, but not an average. Flexibility is one of the biggest things. So actually, flexibility in all its forms. We were really disappointed to see the government remove its care flexibility policy from the Queen's speech. It's something that we think about the amount of effort and time that goes into flexibility for parents. Rightly so, much needed. No one puts the same effort in terms of flexibility for older individuals who make up a third of the workforce. It's a huge opportunity to get it right. What's also interesting, for those who do get it right, they often don't communicate it. So there's research showing, I think, that jobs with flexible working advertised had 30% higher number of applications. It was from a job board study. It's real. So if you've got that flexibility, shout about it. Let people know, and you'll attract candidates. Look at your employment policies and practices. Again, we talked about the amount of focus on parents, rightly so. Think about that when it comes to things like menopause policies. Think about that when it comes to policies such as carers leave to look after elderly parents, for example. There is a lot of opportunity here. 1/3 of the workforce. Let's activate that and let's bring people into employment. And obviously use a diverse source of candidate attraction sources. Restless would be one. So what are the benefits of doing this? So we've talked about the 700,000 people. That's just those that have left since COVID. Amidst the Great Resignation, we've seen that research has consistently shown that older workers have lower attrition rates than younger employers. So one of the things that we often see when people are they have a flexible role, they're looking for places to fill that. Often your two typical sources of candidates would be students or older workers. So actually, both are very good sources. What we see is a lot of employers are coming to us and saying, we like the mix, but actually sometimes with students, they'll come and they'll have to go off to university, they'll have to go off to complete their studies. The attrition rate is much, much lower for this cohort of individuals. So actually, and another surprising stat is 40% of all part-time workers are over the age of 50. So if you do have part-time roles, you absolutely have to be looking there, or you're switching off 40% of your applicant base. So this is interesting. So Lancaster University did a study around hospitality, actually, and they found that customer satisfaction, statistically significant, was higher when one person in the team was over the age of 60, I believe. And also, people told the surveyors that they like to see a mix of ages. It's absolutely age is not better or worse. The whole point is it's around age inclusivity, but that's around the mix of team. So something around happier team, higher well-being, and mutually reinforcing relationships. And that's the big thing, is intergenerational teams are typically happier, have great diversity of thought and foster natural mentoring relationships. So we have, at Restless, we have employees in their 20s, we have employees in their late 60s, we have a real span of it, and we find that leads to a very happy, harmonious team. And I can tell you there's great diversity of thought in a really good way, and debate. Great. So a little bit around Restless, just very quickly. So 1 million members, we've got 60% female membership base. And how can we help? So we can access an incremental talent pool. We can help you with some of the consultancy stuff in terms of understanding how you attract this type of audience and actually how to avoid some of the pitfalls. Thank you. Any questions?